Commander Jake Peterson stood at the main observation deck of Unity Station, watching the steady stream of transport ships departing from the docking bays below. Each vessel carried families and personal belongings away from what had been humanity's largest permanent structure in council space. The station had been home to over 15,000 humans who worked in various capacities, from engineers and doctors to teachers and shop owners. Now all of them were leaving in an orderly procession that seemed almost too calm for such a massive evacuation. Jake had expected more chaos and emotion, but the humans were handling this displacement with remarkable discipline and efficiency. Lieutenant Amy Barnes approached from the operations center carrying a datapad that showed the current evacuation progress. She reported that the final transport from Section 7 had just departed, and they were actually running ahead of the projected schedule by almost 6 hours. Jake nodded without taking his eyes off the viewport, where another transport was maneuvering into position at Docking Bay 12. The ship's name was painted in bright letters along its hull, and Jake recognized it as one of the civilian vessels that normally carried cargo between human colonies. Now it was being used to carry people and whatever possessions they could pack in the time allowed. Dr. Marcus Webb appeared beside, Jake holding his ever-present tablet that contained his research notes and personal files. Marcus had been the chief science officer on Unity Station for 8 years, and he had collaborated with dozens of alien scientists during that time. He mentioned that the Zelnari delegation had just sent another request asking humans to leave behind their agricultural research data before departing. The Zelnari had been working with human botanists for 5 years, developing improved crop strains that could grow in extreme conditions. Apparently, they assumed the research would remain available even after the humans left. Jake's response was immediate and firm when he told Marcus to refuse the request. Marcus seemed surprised because humanity had been sharing that data freely for years, as part of the cooperative research agreements that council members were supposed to maintain. Jake turned away from the viewport and explained that those agreements existed because humanity was part of the community, but now they were not members anymore. Everything human would leave with the humans, including all research, databases, cultural archives, and entertainment libraries. If it was created by human minds or human hands, then it would not remain in council space. The word spread quickly through the stations. Human population and the nature of the evacuation changed subtly but significantly. Human engineers who had been content to simply pack their personal belongings now began systematically dismantling equipment they had installed or modified over the years. Human doctors transferred their patients to alien medical staff as required, but they also deleted their research files from the shared medical databases. Human teachers closed their schools and wiped the educational programs they had developed for mixed-species classrooms. In the commercial districts, human shop owners not only closed their businesses but removed the custom fixtures and display systems they had. Built Station Administrator Jexrol watched this transformation with growing concern from his office overlooking the main concourse. He was a Pelthian with 4 arms and eye stalks that could rotate independently to observe multiple areas simultaneously. He had been administrator of Unity Station for 12 years, which meant he had overseen the facility since before humans arrived. He remembered when the station had been efficient, but unremarkable, and he remembered how human innovation had transformed it into one of the most advanced stations in council space. Now he was watching those improvements being systematically removed, and he was beginning to understand what that meant. His deputy came to report that human maintenance crews were removing power regulators from the energy distribution system in Section 4. These regulators had been designed and installed by human engineers 3 years ago, and they had improved power efficiency by 18% while reducing fluctuations that had previously caused equipment failures. Jexrol asked if the humans were allowed to take those regulators, and his deputy confirmed that the equipment had been built by humans using materials they purchased themselves. Technically, the regulators were human property even though they had been installed in station infrastructure. Jexrol's eye stalks drooped in a gesture of dismay as he realized this pattern was repeating throughout the entire station. In the medical bay, Dr. Lisa Chen was transferring her last patient to the care of a Dralthian physician who had worked alongside her for 4 years. The patient was a young Vrelian who had suffered severe injuries in a docking accident 2 weeks earlier. Lisa had used a combination of traditional Vrelian medicine and human surgical techniques to save the patient's life, and the recovery was progressing well. The Dralthian physician asked Lisa to leave detailed notes about the treatment protocols so he could continue the care properly. Lisa agreed and prepared a basic summary, but she did not include the innovative modifications she had made to the standard procedures. Those modifications were based on her own research and insights developed over years of studying mixed-species medicine. That research was going with her. The Dralthian noticed the summary was less detailed than expected, and he asked if there were additional files he should reference. Lisa told him the standard protocols would be sufficient and that he was a skilled physician who could handle the case. She did not mention that the standard protocols would have resulted in a much longer recovery time, with possible complications. The Dralthian sensed something was being withheld, but Lisa was already moving to the next task, and he did not want to create an incident by pressing the issue. In the engineering sections, the situation was becoming more obvious. Chief Engineer Paul Martinez supervised his teams as they removed not just equipment, but also the detailed maintenance logs and modification records they had kept. The alien engineers who would take over after the human departure asked for copies of these records because they showed how various systems had been optimized and upgraded. Paul refused politely but firmly, explaining that those records represented years of human work and intellectual property. The alien engineers protested that they needed this information to maintain the systems properly, but Paul simply suggested they refer to the original installation manuals and figure it out themselves. One particularly frustrated Torgathi engineer pointed at a coolant recycling system and demanded to know how the humans had improved its efficiency by 30%. Paul looked at the system and then back at the engineer. He explained that the original design had 17 points of inefficiency, and that correcting them required understanding thermal dynamics, fluid mechanics, and materials science at a level that took him 6 years of education, plus 8 years of practical experience to achieve. The Torgathi engineer could learn the same things if he wanted to put in the effort. Then Paul and his team disconnected their custom monitoring equipment and moved to the next section. By the 25th cycle, Unity Station was nearly empty of human presence. The remaining humans worked around the clock to complete their tasks and prepare for departure. There was no complaining or sabotage despite the obvious unfairness of the situation. Humans simply did their jobs with the same professionalism they had always shown, but now that professionalism meant taking everything they had contributed rather than leaving it behind for people who had rejected them. Jake Peterson made his final inspection tour on the 28th cycle, walking through corridors that felt strange and empty without the constant activity of human workers. He passed the school where children had learned together regardless of species. He walked through the medical center where humans had introduced new treatment methods that saved lives. He stood in the engineering hub where human innovation had transformed station operations. Everything looked the same physically, but something essential was missing now. At the main airlock, Jake stopped and pulled out a small sign he had prepared. It was simple white plastic with black letters spelling out a message in several languages, including the common trade tongue that most species could read. The sign said that humanity was here and that they tried to help, and now they were saying goodbye. Jake attached it to the wall next to the airlock using an adhesive compound that would not come off easily. He wanted this message to remain visible for a long time. Lieutenant Amy Barnes joined him at the airlock with the final departure report. All humans had evacuated successfully with 0 casualties and 0 incidents. All human property had been removed or accounted for. Unity Station was officially clear of human presence with 2 cycles to spare before the deadline. Jake took the report and filed it in his personal database. Then he and Amy walked through the airlock for the last time and boarded the final human ship. From the command deck, Jake watched Unity Station recede into the distance. The massive structure still looked impressive against the starfield, but he knew it would never be quite the same. Somewhere inside that station, Administrator Jexrol was probably discovering just how many small things were about to stop war. King properly. Jake felt no satisfaction in that knowledge, but he felt no guilt either. Humanity had been asked to leave, so they left. It was not their responsibility to make it convenient for the people who expelled them. 3 months passed since the last human ship departed from Council space, and the first cracks in the carefully maintained galactic civilization began to show in ways nobody had anticipated. On the mining world of Kepler 442, the entire extraction operation ground to a sudden halt when the automated systems that controlled the drilling equipment crashed without warning. Foreman Krath stood in the control center staring at blank screens that should have been displaying dozens of active mining sites. He slammed his clawed hand against the console and demanded to know what had happened and why the backup systems had not engaged automatically. The assistant foreman checked the diagnostic panels and reported that the backup systems were trying to engage, but they could not sync with the primary network because the connection protocols were not responding. Krath growled in frustration and ordered the engineering team to fix the problem immediately. The Dralthian engineers arrived within minutes and began running their standard diagnostic procedures, but everything they tried resulted in error messages they had never seen before. One of the younger engineers suggested they check the maintenance logs to see if there were any recent changes that might explain the malfunction. The logs revealed a troubling pattern that nobody had noticed until now. Every critical repair for the past 4 years had been performed by the human engineering crew that had been stationed at the mining facility. Every efficiency upgrade and every safety protocol improvement bore human signatures in the file metadata. The current Dralthian engineers had been present during all that time, but they had mostly handled routine tasks while the humans dealt with the complex problems. Now the humans were gone and the systems were failing in ways that the standard procedures could not address. Krath demanded to know why the humans had not documented their methods properly so others could follow them. The head engineer explained that the humans had documented everything according to the official requirements, but those documents described what the systems were supposed to do based on the original installation specifications. What the documents did not include were all the modifications and improvements the humans had made over the years, because those changes had never been officially approved through the Council's bureaucratic processes. The humans had simply made things work better without bothering to file the paperwork, because filing paperwork took months and fixing problems took hours. The mining operation remained shut down for 6 weeks while engineers from 3 different species tried to reverse engineer what the humans had done. They eventually got the systems partially operational again, but production dropped by 40%. Because nobody could figure out how to replicate the efficiency improvements. Krath filed a complaint with the Council demanding compensation for lost revenue, but he was told that humanity's expulsion had been legally proper and no compensation would be provided. He was advised to hire better engineers. Similar problems appeared across Council space like a slow-moving plague that nobody had seen coming. On the trade station orbiting Proxima Centauri, the traffic management system began routing ships through inefficient patterns that added hours to journey times and increased fuel consumption significantly. The station administrator discovered that the routing algorithms were reverting to their original programming from 15 years ago. A human programmer named Carl Hughes had optimized those algorithms 8 years ago, reducing average transit time by 32%, and the system had run perfectly ever since. But Carl had taken his optimization code with him when he left, and now the system was back to its old inefficient patterns. Medical facilities throughout Council territory lost access to treatment databases that human doctors had compiled over the years. These databases contained detailed case studies and treatment outcomes for thousands of mixed-species medical situations that occurred when different alien biologies interacted in unexpected ways. The human medical staff had been meticulous about documenting everything they learned, and they had shared this information freely with their alien colleagues. But the databases had been stored on human-maintained servers, and when the humans left, they took those servers with them. Alien doctors suddenly found themselves unable to reference information they had relied on for years. Entertainment networks discovered that their most popular content had disappeared overnight. Human musicians and storytellers and artists had contributed enormous amounts of material to the galactic cultural exchange, and much of it had become surprisingly popular with alien audiences. A Vrelian drama series that had been the top-rated show in Council space for 2 years simply vanished from streaming services because it had been produced by a human company that deleted all their content when they departed. Millions of viewers across dozens of worlds complained bitterly, but there was nothing the networks could do because the content belonged to humans who were no longer obligated to share it. In the pleasure world of Celestia Prime, the famous zero-gravity gardens that attracted tourists from across the galaxy began to wither and die despite the best efforts of the Floranian caretakers. These gardens had been a marvel of botanical engineering, featuring plants from 40 different worlds all thriving together in an artificial environment. The head caretaker stood among the dying plants with tears streaming down her face because she had dedicated 20 years to maintaining these gardens, and now they were failing. Visiting botanist was called in to diagnose the problem, and after 3 days of investigation, he discovered something disturbing in the environmental logs. The atmospheric mixture in the garden domes was supposed to be maintained at specific levels, according to the original design specifications, but those specifications had been written for the native plants of only 5 worlds. As more species were added to the gardens over the years, the atmosphere should have become incompatible with at least some of the plants. Yet somehow everything had thrived together perfectly. The botanist found the answer buried in the maintenance records. A human gardener named Steve Morgan had been making tiny adjustments to the atmospheric mixture every single day for 3 years. He had never filed official reports about these adjustments because they were so minor that he did not think they warranted bothering the administration. He had simply noticed that certain plants seemed stressed during particular seasons, and he had compensated by tweaking the oxygen levels or humidity or temperature by fractions of a percent. His adjustments had been so subtle that the automated monitoring systems had not flagged them as violations of the standard protocols. Steve was gone now, and the gardens were dying because nobody else had understood what he was doing or why it mattered. The botanist tried to replicate Steve's work, but without years of daily observation and intuitive understanding of how the plants interacted, he could not determine what adjustments were needed. The Floranian caretakers did their best, but within 4 months, half the garden species were dead, and the pleasure world's primary tourist attraction was closed. Indefinitely, the council received reports from 93 different facilities and stations and colonies about systems failing or efficiency, declining, or services being lost. Each individual report seemed minor because it only affected one location or one specific operation. But when viewed together, the reports painted a disturbing picture of how thoroughly humanity had integrated itself into the functioning of Council civilization. Humans had been present in Council space for only 12 years, but in that time they had touched nearly every aspect of galactic life. The economic impact became impossible to ignore when the quarterly reports were compiled. Overall productivity across Council space had declined by 17%. Trade efficiency was down by 12%. Medical outcomes were worse. Entertainment consumption was down. Tourism revenue had dropped. Even diplomatic efficiency had decreased because human translators and cultural liaison officers had been unexpectedly good at helping different species understand each other. Counselor Fendar studied the economic reports in her private office and felt a growing sense of unease. She had voted against the human expulsion, but she had been outvoted by delegates who found humanity threatening. Now those same delegates were complaining about the economic problems and demanding solutions. Fendar pulled up the historical records and compared the 12 years before humanity joined the Council with the 12 years after. The difference was stark and undeniable. Before humans arrived, the Galactic Council had been stable and peaceful and utterly stagnant. Technological advancement was measured in centuries rather than decades. Cultural exchange was minimal because most species had stopped being curious about each other. Economic growth was flat. Then humanity showed up with their endless questions and their strange enthusiasm, and their irritating habit of trying to improve everything they touched. In just 12 years, they had shaken the entire galactic civilization out of its comfortable lethargy. And now they were gone, and the civilization was discovering that it had become dependent on the energy and innovation that humanity provided. Fendar closed the reports and leaned back in her chair. She had tried to warn the Council that expelling humanity was a mistake, but nobody had listened. They had been too afraid of change and too proud to admit that these newcomer humans had anything valuable to teach them. Now they would learn the hard way that progress and comfort rarely coexist, and that pushing away the people who challenge you means accepting stagnation. High Magistrate Zorthak stood at the center of the Council chamber, watching the delegates file in with expressions ranging from anger to worry to barely concealed panic. 6 months had passed since humanity's expulsion, and he had called this emergency session because the situation had deteriorated far beyond what anyone had predicted. The chamber filled quickly because every species wanted their voice heard and their complaints registered. Zorthak waited until the last delegate was seated before raising his crystalline hand to signal the start of proceedings. The chamber fell silent, but the tension was thick enough to feel in the recycled air. Zorthak announced that they were gathered to address the current situation regarding the economic and operational difficulties that had emerged following humanity's departure from Council space. Before he could continue, Ambassador Krell of the Torgathi Union was already on his feet demanding to speak. Zorthak recognized him, and Krell's scales flushed red with agitation as he began speaking in a loud voice that carried to every corner of the vast hall. Krell stated bluntly that the situation was crystal clear and required no lengthy debate. The Council had made a catastrophic error in judgment by underestimating how thoroughly humanity had integrated into their society. Economic output was down 17% across all Council territories. Critical systems were failing on dozens of worlds and stations. Trade routes were inefficient. Medical care had declined. Cultural life was diminished. The solution was obvious, and they needed to invite humanity back immediately before the damage became irreversible. Councillor Fendar rose to support Krell's assessment, adding that her own economic analysts had produced similar findings. She pointed out that in the 12 years since humanity joined the Council, there had been more technological and cultural advancement than in the previous century. The humans had not forced these changes on anyone, but had simply inspired others to try harder and reach higher. Their absence was proving just how valuable their presence had been, but not everyone agreed with this assessment. A senior Vrelian delegate stood and spoke in the clicking language that the translation systems rendered into common speech. He reminded the Council that humanity had been expelled for good reasons. Their individualism and unpredictable creativity had threatened the stability that the Council had maintained for thousands of years. Yes, there were some temporary difficulties now, but these would pass once proper procedures were re-established. Bringing humans back would simply restart the cycle of disruption and chaos that had necessitated their expulsion in the first place. Several other delegates voiced support for this position, arguing that the current problems were simply adjustment pains that would resolve themselves given time. They insisted that the Council had survived for millennia before humanity arrived, and would continue to survive long after this minor crisis passed. One Zentarian diplomat suggested that the real problem was not humanity's absence, but rather the fact that Council species had become lazy and dependent. Perhaps this situation was an opportunity to rediscover their own capabilities and stop relying on outsiders to solve their problems. The debate continued for hours, with delegates presenting data and arguments from every possible angle. Some demanded immediate action to restore relations with humanity. Others counseled patience and self-reliance. A few suggested compromise positions, such as allowing limited human participation in specific sectors without granting full Council membership. The chamber grew heated as frustrations boiled over and old rivalries surfaced in the guise of policy disagreements. Zorthak finally called for order by projecting a harmonic tone from his crystalline body that forced everyone to pause and cover their hearing organs. When silence returned, he announced that they would vote on a proposal to send an official envoy to human territory. This envoy would carry a formal message expressing the Council's regret over what could now be characterized as a misunderstanding. The message would invite humanity to return to the Council with full membership rights restored, and would offer compensation for any damages incurred during the expulsion process. The vote was closer than Zorthak had expected, with barely 60% in favor and a significant minority opposed. Some delegates abstained entirely, unable to choose between practical necessity and stubborn pride, but the majority carried the decision, and Zorthak was authorized to select an appropriate envoy for this delicate mission. After the session ended, he retreated to his private chambers to consider who would be best suited for such an important task. He chose Ambassador Trell, a Zentarian diplomat known throughout Council space for his persuasive abilities and cultural sensitivity. Trell had been neutral during the expulsion vote and had maintained professional relationships with several human diplomats. If anyone could successfully negotiate humanity's return, it would be Trell. Zorthak summoned him and explained the mission, emphasizing that failure was not acceptable. The Council needed humanity back, and Trell needed to make that happen, regardless of what arguments or incentives were required. Trell accepted the assignment and spent 2 weeks preparing for the journey. He studied human psychology and culture. He reviewed transcripts of every major human diplomatic interaction. He consulted with the few delegates who had voted against expulsion to understand what arguments might resonate with human sensibilities. He prepared a formal document that carefully worded the council's invitation to make it seem like a magnanimous gesture rather than a desperate plea. Everything had to be perfect because this mission could determine the future stability of the entire galactic civilization. The journey to human space took 3 weeks, and Trell spent that time rehearsing his presentation and anticipating possible human objections. He arrived at the border world of New Boston, where humanity maintained a significant military and commercial presence. His sleek diplomatic vessel looked small and vulnerable, surrounded by the orbital defense platforms that humans had constructed since their expulsion. Trell noted that these platforms were more advanced than anything the Council currently deployed, and he filed that observation away as additional evidence of human capability. Station Commander Linda Hayes received Trell's request for a diplomatic meeting and granted it within an hour. Trell took this as a positive sign that humans were willing to listen to reason. He docked at the civilian port and was escorted through clean, efficient corridors to a meeting room that was deliberately plain and neutral. Linda Hayes waited for him there along with 2 aides who introduced themselves but said nothing else. Linda gestured for Trell to sit and asked what brought him to New Boston. Trell launched into his carefully prepared presentation, explaining that the Galactic Council had reconsidered its previous decision regarding humanity. He described the economic difficulties that had emerged and framed them as evidence that Council species valued human contributions more than they had realized. He presented the formal invitation with its promises of full membership restoration, official apologies, and financial compensation. He spoke eloquently about the mutual benefits of renewed cooperation and the bright future that humans and aliens could build together. Linda listened without interrupting, and her expression remained politely neutral throughout the entire presentation. When Trell finished and sat back with the satisfied feeling of a job well done, Linda picked up the formal invitation document and read through it carefully. Trell waited confidently, expecting her to request time to consult with her superiors, or perhaps to negotiate the specific terms of compensation. He did not expect what actually happened. Linda set the document down and looked directly at Trell. She thanked him for coming all this way and acknowledged that the Council's offer was generous. Then she stated simply that humanity was not interested in returning to the Council. Trell's translator implant must have malfunctioned, because those words made no sense in the context of everything he knew about the situation. He asked Linda to repeat herself, thinking he had misunderstood. Linda repeated that humanity appreciated the Council's change of heart, but the answer was no. Humans would not be returning to Council space or accepting renewed membership. The decision was final and not open to negotiation. Trell sat in stunned silence, trying to process this unexpected response. He explained that perhaps Linda did not fully understand the offer. The Council was admitting fault and offering compensation. They were inviting humanity back with full honors. This was everything humans should want. Linda's expression hardened slightly as she explained that Trell did not understand the situation, and as well as he thought. Humanity had not left the Council because of economic concerns or political calculations. They had left because they were told they were not welcome. The Council had made it very clear that human creativity and individualism were threats rather than assets. That message had been received and understood. Now the Council was facing consequences and suddenly wanted humans back, but only because humans were useful, not because humans were valued. Trell tried several different approaches over the next hour. He emphasized the mutual benefits of cooperation. He suggested that past misunderstandings could be overcome. He hinted that refusing the Council's offer might have negative consequences for human trade and security. Nothing worked. Linda remained polite but absolutely firm in her refusal. Finally, Trell asked if there was anything the Council could offer that would change humanity's position. Linda considered the question carefully before answering. She said that perhaps in the future, when the Council had learned to value innovation and diversity for their own sake, rather than just for their utility, then maybe humanity would reconsider. But that time was not now and would not be any time soon. She thanked Trell again for his visit and had her aides escort him back to his ship. Trell departed New Boston in a state of shock unable to comprehend how his diplomatic mission had failed so completely. Daniel Price sat in his office on the 47th floor of the External Affairs building, watching the afternoon sun reflect off the Atlantic Ocean in the distance. His position as Secretary of External Affairs for Earth gave him a view that reminded him daily of why humanity had returned home after their expulsion from Council space. The ocean represented depth and mystery and constant change, which were all qualities that the Galactic Council had feared in humanity. Now that fear was costing them dearly, and Daniel felt no sympathy for their predicament. Katie Morrison entered the office carrying a data tablet that displayed the latest message from the Galactic Council. She had been Daniel's assistant during the expulsion hearings and now served as his deputy in the new position he held. She set the tablet on his desk and told him he needed to read this particular message because it was significantly different from the previous ones. Daniel picked up the tablet and began reading through the formal diplomatic language that attempted to hide desperation behind bureaucratic politeness. The Council was offering full reinstatement of humanity's membership with no probationary period or restrictions. They acknowledged that the expulsion had been an error in judgment, based on incomplete understanding of human contributions to galactic society. They offered financial compensation equivalent to 5 years of trade revenue. They promised humans would be given seats on the High Council itself, rather than just General Assembly positions. They even offered to name one of the Council's major space stations after a human of Earth's choosing. The message concluded by requesting an immediate response and offering to send a delegation to Earth for direct negotiations. Katie watched Daniel's face as he read, and she could see he was not impressed by the generous terms being offered. She asked if this was everything humanity wanted and pointed out that the Council was essentially admitting they were wrong and begging humans to come back. Daniel set the tablet down and leaned back in his chair. He asked Katie if she remembered what High Magistrate Zorthak had said to him privately after the expulsion vote was announced. Katie shook her head because she had not been present for that private conversation. Daniel's expression hardened as he recalled the memory. Zorthak had told him that humanity was like a child playing with tools it did not understand. He had said humans needed to learn their place in the established order of galactic civilization. The words had been delivered with condescending certainty that the older, wiser species knew what was best. Daniel had simply thanked Zorthak for his honesty and walked away, but those words had burned themselves into his memory. Katie asked if that meant Daniel was going to refuse the Council's offer, and Daniel confirmed that yes, humanity would decline. Katie seemed uncertain as she pointed out that refusing such a generous offer might seem petty or vindictive. Daniel shook his head and explained that this was not about revenge or wounded pride. The Council had not expelled humanity because humans were actually dangerous. They had expelled humanity because human success and innovation made the older species feel inadequate and threatened. That fundamental problem had not changed regardless of how generous the compensation package might be. Katie sat down across from Daniel and asked what humanity would do instead. Daniel smiled and pulled up a series of files on his display screen. He showed her reports from the past 6 months detailing new trade agreements humanity had established with unaffiliated species who existed outside Council control. There were technology exchange programs with species the Council considered too primitive to be worth their attention. There were cultural partnerships with colonies that the great galactic powers had overlooked or dismissed. There were defense pacts with independent worlds that wanted protection, but did not want to join the Council's bureaucratic system. In the 6 months since their expulsion, humanity had been extraordinarily busy building a new network of relationships based on mutual respect rather than hierarchical control. These species appreciated human innovation because it helped them solve their own problems rather than making them feel inferior. They welcomed human questions and creativity because they were still curious about the universe rather than being satisfied with ancient knowledge. They valued human partnership because humans treated them as equals rather than primitives who needed guidance. Daniel explained that humanity was not interested in returning to a system that valued them only for their utility. If the Council wanted humanity back now, it was because humans were useful, not because humans were valued as equals. That distinction mattered greatly, and Daniel would not compromise on it. Katie understood and asked what message she should send in response to the Council's offer. Daniel dictated a brief polite reply thanking the council for their generous terms, but respectfully declining the invitation. Humanity had moved on and was pursuing other opportunities that better aligned with their values and goals. Meanwhile, across council space, the deterioration continued at an accelerating pace. Unity Station was now operating at barely 60% efficiency, despite the best efforts of the alien staff who remained. Administrator Jexrel spent his days dealing with cascading failures in systems that had worked perfectly when humans maintained them. The station's reputation as a premier facility had evaporated, and several major businesses had relocated to other locations. Tourist traffic had declined by 40% because the amenities that had made Unity Station attractive were no longer available or no longer worked properly. Jexrel stood in the empty human quarter looking at the sign Jake Peterson had left beside the main airlock. Someone had tried to remove it, but the adhesive had been some kind of human compound that bonded at the molecular level. Removing the sign would require cutting out that entire section of wall and replacing it. Jexrel had decided to leave it in place because somehow it seemed appropriate. The sign read that humanity was here and they tried to help, and now they were saying goodbye. Jexrel reached out with one of his forearms and touched the sign gently. He spoke aloud to the empty corridor, admitting that the council had not listened when they should have. Humanity had spoken loudly through their presence, making everything better and more efficient and more interesting. But the council had been too proud and too afraid to appreciate what they had. Now humanity's absence was speaking even louder, showing everyone exactly what had been lost. Reports continued flowing into council headquarters from facilities and stations and colonies across galactic space. The mining operations that had employed human engineers were still running below capacity. The medical facilities that had relied on human research were struggling with complex cases. The entertainment networks that had distributed human content were losing subscribers. The trade routes that humans had optimized were costing more time and fuel. Even the diplomatic corps was having difficulty because human translators and cultural liaison had possessed an unusual talent for helping different species understand each other. High Magistrate Zorthak reviewed these reports in his private chambers and finally allowed himself to acknowledge the truth he had been avoiding. The council had not expelled humanity to protect galactic civilization. They had expelled humanity to protect their own comfortable stagnation. The older species had built a society that was stable and peaceful, but utterly lacking in dynamism or growth. Then humanity arrived with their endless energy and curiosity, and suddenly the stagnation became obvious. Rather than embracing the change and rising to the challenge, the council had chosen to eliminate the problem by expelling the humans. Now they were learning that you cannot maintain greatness by avoiding challenges. The Galactic Council had been great once when its member species were still exploring and innovating and pushing boundaries. But somewhere over the millennia they had become satisfied with what they had achieved. They had stopped asking questions and stopped seeking improvements. They had created elaborate procedures and protocols that prioritized stability over progress. Humanity had threatened that comfortable existence simply by refusing to accept things as they were. Zorthak composed a personal message to Daniel Price, separate from the official council communications. He admitted that he had been wrong about humanity and wrong about what the council needed. He acknowledged that his comments about humans being like children had been born from fear, rather than wisdom. He explained that he now understood humanity's refusal to return because why would anyone want to rejoin a society that valued them only when it became inconvenient to do without them? He did not ask Daniel to reconsider because he knew that would be pointless. He simply wanted Daniel to know that at least one member of the council understood what had really happened. Daniel received Zorthak's message and read it carefully. He showed it to Katie and they discussed whether to respond. Daniel decided that Zorthak deserved a reply because his message had been honest and personal. Daniel wrote back thanking Zorthak for his candor and explaining that humanity bore no ill will toward the council. Humans simply needed to build relationships with people who wanted them around for who they were, rather than what they could provide. Perhaps someday in the future, when the council had evolved beyond its fear of change, then humanity and the council could interact as true equals. But that day was not today and might not come for generations. Across the galaxy, humanity continued its quiet work building new communities and helping species who asked for help. They established research stations in partnership with curious aliens who wanted to learn rather than just use. They created educational programs that emphasize creativity and critical thinking, rather than memorization of established facts. They built trade networks based on mutual benefit, rather than hierarchical exploitation. They proved through their actions that there was an alternative to the Council's stagnant model of galactic civilization. The Council watched these developments with mixed emotions. Some delegates felt vindicated in their decision to expel humanity, seeing the human network as proof that humans could not integrate into proper society. Others felt regret understanding that they had lost something valuable that might never return. A few felt hope thinking that perhaps humanity's example would eventually inspire the Council to reform itself. But regardless of how individual delegates felt, the reality remained unchanged. Humanity had been told they were not wanted, and they had left quietly without drama or threats. Now their absence was teaching the galaxy a lesson that words never could have conveyed. You do not realize how much someone contributes until they stop contributing, and by then it might be too late to fix what was broken.